So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Joe, of course, for making the time as well. Yes, our guest today is author Jo Ivester, and Jo's early years were spent in Massachusetts, where her father was a doctor. In 1967, he left his practice to become the medical director of a clinic in a small all-Black town in the cotton fields of the Mississippi Delta. And Jo's family was one of two white families and the only Jewish one. When they became involved with the civil rights movement, it was her introduction to tikkun olam, which, as all attending may know, is the Hebrew expression meaning to repair the world. In her early 50s, she discovered that sharing her stories through writing and speaking is her natural path for advocacy, and her first book, The Outskirts of Hope, was published in 2015 and described her family's time in Mississippi. Her more recent book, which was published a couple of years ago in 2020, is called Once a Girl, Always a Boy, and is inspired by the story of her transgender son. Let's see here. She currently lives in Austin, Texas, where she serves on the boards of Equality Texas, the Central Texas Anti-Defamation League, the Texas board of GLSEN, which is the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Jo Ivester.
Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you to everybody just for welcoming me into your community right now. I wish I could be there in person, and I'm hoping that I will be able to come in person perhaps in the fall and meet all of you and just get to chat more. But for today, we'll have to suffice with Zoom, and I will spend about half an hour sharing some stories, and I'll do a brief reading toward the end of that from my book, and then open it up for questions, because I'd really love to get your thoughts and your comments and get a discussion going with these issues about racial relations that unfortunately are still just as relevant today as they were in 1967. So as Neil said, back in 1967, when I was a 10-year-old child, my dad decided to move our family from the suburbs of Boston to a small all-Black town in the Mississippi Delta. And there he was the manager for a clinic, for a medical clinic, and my mom taught English at the local high school, and I was the only white kid at our junior high. And by saying junior high instead of middle school, I'm of course dating myself, because they don't call it junior high anymore, but in my mind and heart, the school I attended in Mound Bayou, Mississippi was a junior high. So while we were there, we couldn't help but getting pulled into the civil rights movement. And as a child, I knew that I was involved in something incredibly important. I knew that I was really proud of my parents and that they were heroic in their way. But I didn't really understand everything that was going on. I had a child's perspective in this front row seat of the civil rights movement. At one point, one of my dad's colleagues from Boston came to just see what was going on with the clinic and visit and think about what they could learn to take elsewhere. And he, at one point, he turned to me and he said, "Well, Joe, I'm really curious, do you ever forget that all of your friends are Black?" And at first I thought he was joking, because I could look at them and I could see that they were Black. And when I realized he was serious, I said, "Well, no, I don't forget that, but I forget that I'm different." So in a way, I kind of forgot that I was white. And that was because my group of friends had accepted me. So let me back up a minute, because acceptance came after some effort. So you know where the story's going. You know that it ended up being a really phenomenal experience for my family, and whatever my family did for the town did so much more for my family. It was this incredible opportunity. But the book is called The Outskirts of Hope, and some of you may recognize that phrase. I wish I had come up with it. It's a beautiful phrase, but it's actually from a speech by President Johnson when he announced the war on poverty. And he said at that time, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, "Too many Americans live on the outskirts of hope. some because of the color of their skin, some because of poverty, and all too many because of both. Our task is to replace their despair with opportunity. And with that, he announced the start of the War on Poverty. He announced funding for it through the Office of Economic Opportunity. Some of you that were around during that time may recognize those phrases. And that's what funded my dad's clinic. So with not a whole lot of warning, my dad came home and said, we're going to Mississippi. He actually had accepted the job before telling my mom. So that was pretty amazing. The way I found out was he made a game of it, as he did with so many things. You'll see me grin big when I talk about my parents. They were amazing people, and I miss them every day. But my dad started out by looking around the lunch table, and I was there with my two older brothers. My sister was already off to college. And he said, if you could move any place in the country, where would you want to go? Well, we were a very well-read family. I was in the middle of a book about some kids that lived in the Arizona desert, and they got to ride horses and hike in the mountains. So I said, I want to go to Arizona. And one of my brothers goes, I want to go to Hawaii, because he loved the beach in Cape Cod. He thought Hawaii must be better. My older brother was reading Call of the Wild. He said, I want to go to Alaska. My mother chose Puerto Rico because they had just returned from their 25th wedding anniversary and had been intrigued by that territory. And my dad goes, you're all wrong, we're going to Mississippi. That's how we found out. He had gone back to school for a degree in public health, having gotten a little bit restless when his pediatric practice was going so smoothly. And in his class, a gentleman showed up, a physician, saying, we need volunteers. We've opened a new clinic in a very poor neighborhood of Boston. And some of you are doctors that were in public health there. And so we want you to come and volunteer your time. So my dad went to volunteer. And when he showed up and was chatting with Dr. Geiger, who was the organizer of all this, Dr. Geiger said, well, we'd love you to volunteer here. That's great. But what we really want is for you to move to Mississippi and run the clinic there. And my dad said yes. Well, years later, I had a chance to interview Dr. Geiger, and I was able to ask him, what did you see in my father that made you offer him that position? And I'm really primed to hear wonderful things. Oh, your dad was such a great doctor, or we could tell he was a good manager, or we could tell that he had this passion for serving people. And Jack looked at me and started laughing, and he said, Jo, I didn't have a line of doctors going out the door and around the block. Your father was willing to go. And what I've learned through my own advocacy is that a huge part of it is just showing up, just being willing to be there. And in my dad's case, being there meant the whole family was there. Well, there wasn't a lot of training for my family before we went. We didn't know what to expect. We didn't have the internet. We couldn't look at information. I'd read To Kill a Mockingbird. That was the extent of my awareness of the Deep South and racial relations. And my mother was equally unprepared. She'd had a little bit of experience during World War II with the segregated train cars. And she knew that she felt that was wrong, but she didn't really know very much about it. And so the night that they were getting ready to go to Mississippi, they flew into Memphis, Tennessee, and stayed overnight, and they were going to drive the 2 to 3 hours south, about 100 miles from Memphis on the old Blues Highway, Highway 61. And it was a difficult drive. And my mother, as she saw the poverty, was getting more and more nervous. And there's kind of no delicate way to put this, but the more nervous she got, the more she needed a facility. And she was just getting all squirmy and feeling desperate. But it was such a poor area. There were no gas stations that they were driving by. They were going through the cotton fields. She was starting to think, well, she would just squat by the side of the car, if you'll forgive my being very descriptive. But then they got to a gas station and it was deserted, but there was a restroom. And she jumped out of the car and she saw, but it didn't register, that there was a sign on the bathroom door that said whites only. And she was so desperate to get inside that what went through her mind was, I'm so glad I'm white. She was a rule follower. And so she was white, she could use the bathroom. Well, she didn't realize what a mistake that was. My dad didn't realize it, and he shared this as an interesting story when they finally got to town and were starting to meet some of the townspeople. And they were horrified. No one had said to my mother that if you're a civil rights worker coming in from the north to Mississippi, you don't take advantage of what today we would view as white privilege. You don't drink at the water fountain that says coloreds only. You don't go and watch a movie in a theater that the white people sit in the main area and the black population is constrained to sit in a balcony that is not as well cared for, if they're allowed in at all. You don't take advantage of white privilege. And my mother had done so. And she was rejected. People did not. So one person actually said to her, don't come to town. You don't understand. And yeah, we want your husband to be a doctor here. We need the medical care, but you go stay in Massachusetts where you can live your privileged life. She didn't word it that way, a little more rudely, but it was pretty clear that we were just not prepared. We didn't know how to be allies. And it was very hard for my mother. What changed things for her was when October came around and folks were started getting ready for the election. So there's a long history of Jewish involvement in voting rights in Mississippi. The Freedom Summer, 1964, when thousands of college students and young adults came into Mississippi to register voters. A large number of them were Jewish. Many of the doctors and lawyers that supported them were Jewish. And that was what my mother knew about and cared about. And so she thought about voting. And we get to October, and for the first time, there was a candidate on the ballot for a countywide position that was Black. First time since Reconstruction. Now, Mount Bayou was all Black, so its political structure was all Black as well. We had a Black mayor, we had a Black police officer and firefighter. And notice I'm using singular. We had one police officer, we had one firefighter. But there were countywide positions, and Mount Bayou got to vote as well. But no one ever thought that a Black person could win the election. Well, my mother said, we're going to change that. And she started lobbying. She said to her students, well, I know you can't vote yet. The voting age was still 21 at that point. She said, but you've got big brothers and big sisters and your parents and your aunts and your uncles. And every day I want you to come to school and tell us, who did you talk into voting? And she wasn't the only one doing this. People all over town were trying to get folks to vote. They were all registered, but people were afraid to vote. The KKK had been making threats and saying, if you vote, we will hunt you down. And it wasn't that, it was only 10 years earlier that Emmett Till had been murdered just a short way from Mount Bayou. And I'm not going to go into that whole story. I'm sure that, that you're familiar with it, but this was a violent time. So voting day came around and some amazing volunteers had things planned out, and they would go out in pairs in a car to collect people from the rural area around town, out in the plantation or out in the rural is what we called it. And they'd have one guy driving and one guy holding a shotgun. And they'd keep the window open a little bit so that the tip of the shotgun was visible outside. And they would go and collect people and bring them into town to the high school so that they could vote. And when they got to the parking lot, there was an armed escort that would bring them from the cars into the school. And all day long, cars were just pouring in to the high school, and people voted. And when it was all over, for the first time, a Black person was elected to be a beat supervisor. Now, you may not be familiar with the term beat supervisor. It's kind of a Mississippi thing, but they're the ones that are responsible for the city services in a county like Bolivar County, deciding when are you going to repair holes in the street or put in a sidewalk? When is the trash going to get collected? What do you do if there's a power outage? It's not like there were huge staffs to do this. These were small communities. And it had always been a white person, which meant the white parts of town got the service, and the Black parts of town, or towns like Mound Bayou, which were all Black, got nothing. Now with a Black person there for the first time, people could get some basic services. We got our trash collected for the first time. As a 10-year-old, my job was to burn the trash each week because we didn't have trash collection. Now that's not uncommon in a rural setting, but this was a small town. We should have had that service, and we got that service. So these volunteers had done a tremendous thing, and my mom got some of the credit. And she deserved, her little piece of the credit was well deserved, but that's when she got accepted into the town. It was through her push for voting, and it was right in line with all of those Jewish college students and young adults that had come to Mississippi in the summer of '64. Well, my own acceptance was a lot easier. As a 10-year-old kid, I was very outgoing. You can kind of guess that from how comfortable I am sitting here and just chatting with you. And I was also very tomboyish, which you could also guess from my very short kind of boyish haircut. So I get there, it's the first day after school, and I don't really know anybody. I met a few kids in school. I, as rapidly as I could, get out of my skirt and blouse that was required for school in those days, and switched into jeans and a t-shirt and sneakers, and went out looking for fun. And I found some boys about 10 years old, just like me, playing football, a little pickup game in an empty lot a few doors down from the school. So I said, "Hey, can I play?" Well, they didn't know what to make of me. I mean, here's this white kid who they don't know asking to play football, and it's a girl. And they're like, "What do we do?" Well, they told me later what they did do, which was that they huddled together and they had this very rapid conversation acknowledging the problem I'd created, unintentionally. Remember, we're not trained. We don't know what the expectations are. Well, each of these kids had been raised to not interact with white people because white people were dangerous. If they had to go to the next town, if members of our town went to the next town to go shopping, say, they could show up where the grocery store was integrated because their money was welcome. But if they were in line and a white person was ready to come in line, they would always cut. They had to wait. They were taught that if a white person asked them to do something, it wasn't really a request, it was an order. And these kids had been trained to look down, make no eye contact, and to say, "Yes, sir, yes, ma'am," and do what they'd been told. So here this white kid had said, "Can I play?" So they felt like they had to say yes. But on the other hand, there were also rules that you weren't supposed to have physical contact. And football's a physical sport. Well, in the next town over, if you had a white person walking down the sidewalk and a black person walking down the sidewalk, the expectation was that the black person would jump into the street and get out of the way. Didn't matter if it was muddy, didn't matter if there were cars coming. They had to get off the sidewalk to avoid the possibility of their shoulders brushing against each other. No contact allowed. If they were in a store and handing over a quarter to pay money, they were supposed to hold the quarter by the very edge, and the white person would take it by the very edge to avoid having the hands come in contact. So here's this white kid, and not just white, but a girl, saying, "Can I play football?" So within a minute, they had this discussion because they had been so well trained to be aware of this for their own safety. And they came up with a plan, which was that they would say yes, honor that part of their training, but in the first play, they would tackle me so hard that I would cry and run away and never want to play with them again. Problem solved. Well, they didn't know me. They didn't know that I'd been playing football since I was 3 years old in our neighborhood, and I loved it. And so all I'm thinking is, they said, yes, I get to play. And then the first play, they give me the ball to carry. And I'm like over the moon, and I've got it tucked under my arm, thinking my big brother would be so proud of me that I'm protecting the ball. And I've got my arm out to stiff arm anyone who's trying to tackle me. And I'm running my heart out. And then the other team tackled me, and my own team tackled me. They all just piled on top. And I was having so much fun. It wasn't until hours later that I realized I was all kind of bruised. I came up smiling and laughing and having fun. And one of the kids, Clarence, who I'm still friends with, we still text back and forth or call each other, 10 years old, Clarence said, oh, well, I guess she can play. And I don't know whether he meant, oh, she knows how to play football, or I guess we'll let her play. But he said, his words were, I guess she can play. With that one statement, he pulled me into the group. And I had my circle of friends from that moment on. I saw that group of little boys every day from then until the day we left town. So I think about kids and their ability to accept and how natural it can be, despite all of the training that they'd had, that said white people are dangerous. And despite me having moved from a big city to this little tiny town with 1,300 people and just being totally out of my element, we all just played together. And that was great. So that acceptance, it was really important for my family. And over the next year or so, there was time after time where we were aware of how gracious the townsfolk had been in letting us into their circle. We were outsiders, and they didn't let us feel that way after the first little bit. That really came to a head April 4th, 1968. I'm seeing some nods. That was the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. And in our town, that felt very personal. He was in Memphis, Tennessee at the time. He was there for a sanitation workers' strike. And his team had been speaking with our town leaders about how he was going to come and speak at one of our churches when the strike was over and he was able to leave. Mound Bayou was historic. It was the largest, oldest all-Black town in the country. And so civil rights leaders had been working from Mound Bayou and in Mound Bayou for years and years. And Martin Luther King and his staff knew about us. And everyone was so excited at the possibility that he was going to come. And when he was killed, it felt like a family member. People were crying in the street. Over breakfast, we were getting phone calls from folks from all over the country, from family and from my dad's colleagues that were still back in Boston, saying, we know you don't have TV, so you don't see it happening, but there is rioting going on all over the country. And stores are getting burned out, and people are getting hurt, and you need to get out of town. Because even though you're there to help, you're a target. And my parents had this very intense conversation over breakfast, and my dad said, I have to go to the clinic. If people are going to be hurt, I need to be there to take care of them. And my mom said, I have to be at school for my students. Everybody's going to be upset. I got to be there. Well, then my brothers and I started saying, well, if you guys are going to work, we want to go to school. And we did. And I'm so glad we did. I got to school, and as I walked onto the campus, the first thing that happened was another 10-year-old who I didn't really know well, but everybody kind of knew everybody because it's a small town. He came over to me, and I didn't know whether he was going to punch me or what, but he made a real point of coming over to me, and he hugged me. And the two of us embraced and just started crying. And the whole day was like that. And as the town grieved, they allowed us to grieve with them. Well, my mom, with her students, decided, with her students, not her, she was the tag along. Her students decided that they wanted to protest. They wanted to do something that would be visible to the white community. And they said, we can protest all we want here in town, but no one will see that. And so what they planned was a march the next town over, where they would get together the high school students from our town, and then from the black high school in the next town over. There was a black high school and a white high school. There was a black part of town and a white part of town divided by the railroad tracks. That was the way all the small southern towns worked. And my mom asked if she could go. She asked if teachers were going, and when she found out some were, she said, can I come? And they said yes. And my brother, who was in 9th grade at the time, just assumed he was going. And I wanted to go, and I was told, no, you're too young. This could be dangerous. So my exposure to it is purely what I heard from my mother and my brother. So what I want to do now is share with you a brief reading from my book, and it's in my mother's voice. So picture a woman in her mid-40s with 3 kids ranging from 10 to 14 and a daughter home back in Boston in college, and taking risks and knowing that her 14-year-old son is there with her. On the day of the march, the sky was a brilliant blue, the sun beating down on us as we waited. The organizers were walking about telling everyone what to expect and explaining the route we would follow, starting in the black section of town, continuing on through the white neighborhoods, and concluding at City Hall in the town square. As if on cue, 9 police cars pulled up, their sirens off but their lights flashing. They took up the whole block. The few stragglers still in the street jumped to the relative safety at the side of the road. There were no sidewalks. The black part of town where we had gathered consisted of only 5 unpaved blocks. On one side were vacant, muddy lots open to the cotton fields in the distance. On the other, small wooden shacks lined the street, each with a rickety front porch, furnished with 1 or 2 old rocking chairs. We stayed on the side with the shacks. I swallowed hard as I noticed that in each car, an officer held a rifle pointed out the window. The dark reflective sunglasses the men wore made it impossible to see where they were looking, and I felt as if they were all staring directly at me. In several of the cars, police dogs sat in the back seat watching everything, looking fierce and ready to attack. Shelby must have pulled in officers and dogs from the whole region to come up with such a show of force. The signal came, and we began to walk slowly down the sidewalk, the sun already high in the sky. I looked into the street and noticed that a police car stayed right beside my partner and me, the officer in the passenger seat pointing his rifle at my partner the entire time. They had partnered up to walk in pairs. As we started down the sidewalk, people on the porches began singing hymns. An elderly person singing occupied every rocking chair we marched by. They waved to us, cheered us on with their voices raised in song. Many cried. What a change a few minutes later when we marched into the white section of town. It was a different world. Instead of dirt roads, there were paved streets lined with well-kept sidewalks. Rather than tiny wooden shacks, handsome brick and stone homes with manicured lawns stood alongside the streets. Instead of the warmth of voices raised in song, there was absolute quiet, with not a soul in sight, for the residents had locked up their homes as tightly as possible. Drapes were drawn shut, streets were deserted, the silence relentless. Every now and then, someone peeked through a curtain or openly glared. We marched for close to 2 hours, crisscrossing the town until we'd walked down every block, Finally, we stopped in front of City Hall, and one of the ministers stepped to the front of the line. In a deep, booming voice, he said, "Let us all now bow our heads in prayer." We stood as if in a trance, swaying silently back and forth. After a minute of silence, the minister spoke again. "We offer thanks, O Lord, that the good people of Shelby have allowed us to walk peaceably through this town. And we pray that the leaders of this community, the men working in this very building, will open their hearts and stop the oppression of their Black neighbors." With one voice, the marchers responded, "Amen." Resuming our march, we returned to the Black section of town where we stood in front of one of the churches, a small wooden structure with peeling paint. The students wandered off, but the adults gathered on the church steps, talking over the events of the day. Suddenly, over the chattering, I heard a deep baritone quietly singing, "We shall overcome." One by one, the rest of us joined in. As if choreographed, we formed 4 lines on the church steps, standing close together with arms linked. The police took notice. They pulled their cars up in a line facing us and turned off their motors. Sitting in their cars and staring, they pointed their rifles at us, just waiting for an opportunity to fire. We acted as if they weren't there and continued to sing for another 10 minutes, verse after verse, gently defying them. It did end peacefully. No one gave the police any reason to become aggressive, and the police didn't make a move. Afterwards, they all came back to our town, not just our own high school kids, but the kids from the next town over. And for hours, we gathered in a big vacant lot on a field in the middle of town. And people sang and ministers preached and restaurants brought food. And we celebrated the life of Dr. King. Well, coming out of that, my mom felt she had to do something more. And so she called a friend of hers who was the dean of students at Brandeis University back in Boston. And she said, "Leonard, we got to do something." And he said, "Well, how about if we get some of your students here?" So the two of them cooked up this idea that we would start a pipeline of students from Mount Bayou, Mississippi to Boston. And Brandeis was the first, and then Tufts University joined in. And for years, students came from Mississippi. The townspeople had to come up with the money for winter clothes, and the schools covered everything else. And it was this incredible support. And we ended up with the region having more Black people in the medical profession than any other part of the country on a per capita basis. And it was because of that program that got started. So the next year went by, and I thought we were going to stay there all through my high school. I expected to graduate from JFK High, and that this was my home. But then things got violent, and in 1969, I was beaten up. And what happened is 4 of the town teenagers attacked me when I was in a treehouse near my home, and basically a big platform in a tree. And it was a sexual assault. I was 11 years old, and I ended up with a concussion and some broken ribs. My leg was messed up enough I couldn't really walk. And Father Guidry, one of the town leaders from the Catholic Church, approached my parents, and he said, "I think this was politically motivated, and these young men might even have been paid," because my mother was continuing to teach in her classroom Black literature and sending kids off to college, and the KKK was getting upset. And the threats had been coming in, and then I got beaten up, and it coincided with a day that my dad was out of town, and that the school board was about to have a meeting to vote on some books that my mother was trying to bring into the classroom that included the autobiography of Malcolm X and Shakespeare's play Othello. And they both scared everybody because they were afraid of the KKK, but they wanted their kids exposed to the literature. So that was the setting of when I got beaten up. Father Guidry asked us to leave town. And at first my parents thought that he was worried about our safety, and they said, no, we're gonna stick this out. This is where we're needed. And Father Guidry said, I'm not asking for your safety. I'm asking for the town. And if you think about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the many other places where there had been riots where the white people in town came and burned down the black sections of town, that's what Father Guidry was worried about. He said, even if the KKK paid these kids to do this or encouraged them to do this somehow, it was still 4 of the town's teenagers that beat up a white girl. And he was terrified that the KKK would come in and burn down the town. When my parents understood that, they said, okay, we'll leave. And as soon as I was well enough to travel, which was 2 days, they put me in the back seat of the car, lying stretched out with my head in my brother's lap, and we drove out of town. And I didn't go back for 40 years. I didn't go back until I decided to write my book about the time there. And then I went back to just absorb the environment, to see how it had changed, see how it had stayed the same. And I was terrified of going back, partly because I didn't really want to deal with being in the place where I had been assaulted. And I, like many victims of a sexual assault, I felt embarrassed by that and somehow to blame. But partly because I had this family legend at this point of how we had been helpful and that we'd had an impact on this little town. And I didn't want to get there and find out that, no, we really hadn't, that we hadn't been welcomed, they'd put up with us, or maybe even worse, that we'd been forgotten. And instead what happened was I was welcomed with open arms. And it ended up making up the last chapter of my book. So I want you to read that. But I have retained the contacts now that I'd lost for 40 years. And now I've been back 3 or 4 times, always staying with Clarence in his home. And I've met his children, and now he's got grandkids. I mean, this is a big part of my life. And it set me up for advocacy work the rest of my life. And I would say that it's kind of like a 3-legged stool where each leg provides the support and makes it all balanced. The first thing the town gave me was an awareness that not everybody had life as easy as we did, and that there were people very much in need, and that there were people that were discriminated against and faced prejudice every day, and that today we have the terminology to describe it as systemic racism, and we're fighting that. We're trying to become anti-racist. We didn't have that terminology then, but I got that awareness as an 11-year-old child. The second was that it gave me the courage to do something, to participate, because we went through some hard stuff, and it worked. And it doesn't always, but in our case it did. And the third thing was to recognize that we could make a difference, that one family, one individual can really matter. And so that's set me up for a life of being devoted to Tikkun Olam. And that's why I now visit communities, whether it's book groups or temple groups or church groups or civic organizations or students. This is what I do with my time, because I believe in sharing stories as a way to make people more comfortable with that they're not familiar with, because it's hard to be afraid of that you know better. So when we know people who have been involved, it personalizes it. And I ask everybody that I get a chance to ask, please get involved yourself. Speak up. Vote for people who will fight the good fight. If you're in a position for philanthropic giving, give to organizations that are joined in this battle. And make friends with people who are different from yourselves. So with that, just thank you again for inviting me to join you. And I talked a little bit longer than I planned, but wanted to open it up now for questions and discussion.
Yes, thank you so much for such a heartfelt presentation. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure others here do as well. I'll start us off, if it's all right, with a question from the chat. I think I know the answer to part of this, but you can be the one to answer, of course. Were there any other Jews when you lived there? And if so, did they constitute a community? And the second part is, if there were other Jews, were they also committed to bridging the racial divide between white and black?
Okay, so in Mount Bayou, there were no other Jewish families. So I picked the word family carefully. There were other Jewish individuals that had shown up as part of the civil rights movement in 1964 and stuck around. Jack Geiger, whose dream this was to create this, a physician out of Tufts University, had showed up on the summer of '64 and then made all of this happen. And he lived part-time in the town and is Jewish. So there were individuals, he was a long-term presence. There were others that came and went, but there were no other kids. And years later, I realized that there had been a Jewish community the next town over in Cleveland with an active youth group. And I asked my parents about, why had we not become a part of that? Because we didn't. And they basically explained that being Jewish was a two-edged sword in the Black South. That on the one hand, we had this history of being involved in civil rights, but on the other hand, there was a history of being the shop owners, where the shops were appreciated for letting Black community members shop there, but people still felt disrespected and treated unfairly. I mentioned that a white person would automatically would get to cut in line. Black people were not allowed to try on clothing because then a white person wouldn't buy them. People ran up credit, and it was, on the one hand, you could say the shopkeepers were doing a favor. On the other hand, it meant that the Black communities and the poor white individuals could never get ahead. But it tied people to the land where they couldn't get away from sharecropping, and the life in many ways was not a whole lot better than slavery. And they didn't have the freedom to get away because they owed money. So we had this dichotomy in an attitude toward the Jews, and we had the religious antagonism. I literally had friends at Easter time that had been so friendly the rest of the year, and then for Easter weekend they would accuse me of killing their savior and being mad at me. And it's like, what did I do? I'm 10, 11-year-old kid, and in Boston I'd never experienced anything like that. So my parents were concerned that if we reached out to the Jewish community the next town over, that we would step on the toes of our Black neighbors and that we would antagonize them. And given a choice, they said, right now we are serving the Black community. And as a child, I didn't realize that I'd even stepped away from my culture because I could just assume it in Boston. It was just taken for granted that I wasn't going to go to school on the high holidays. It was taken for granted that a bunch of my friends lit menorahs at Hanukkah. Some of them, including us, had Christmas trees as well. It was easy to be Jewish in Boston. And I didn't realize I'd stepped away from it until my book came out and I found an ally in the Jewish community. And through the Jewish Book Network, I started going out and speaking to temple groups and realized, oh my gosh, this is a homecoming for me. And I reconnected with my Jewish roots as a result of writing the book.
Wow, that's wonderful. Okay, well, let me open things up for others who are here.
I promise I won't take that long to answer other questions.
Oh, that's all right. Appreciate the thoroughness. Yes, if others who are here would like to unmute, and make a comment or ask a question, that's fine. I'll open that up now if folks would like to do that. And if not, I have a couple questions of my own. So what, unless others would like to join in, I'll ask a couple of questions that came up for me during your talk. There are a couple issues I would like to hear your kind of take on, or your view of, through the filter of what you've told us about your experience and your family's experience. One thing is, in the context of where you all lived, clearly there was no question you were white, like the identity among, as well as being Jewish maybe, but you were white. And today I feel like, and not just today, but it's I've seen more of it in the last 5-7 years, there's more discussion of, are white Jews white? Is it really the same? And what does that identity look like when it's a person who's an Ashkenazi Jewish person living in American society? Are they white in the way that other groups are white? And I'm interested to hear your take on that, because part of it is context, I think. In the context of where you were, it seems like, of course you're white. Now, I don't know, it depends where one is. And that question is alive again in a way I haven't felt it has been earlier in my life.
Yeah, great question. And I think you're right that it does depend on where you are. I think if I were living in Boston, I would say that I just blend in with the population. I'm reminded of having gone to Israel with the Anti-Defamation League on a tour with about 15 other women. And we all became friends and took some marvelous pictures. And I sent them home to my family. And my son, my oldest son, who was probably 25 at the time, said to me, "Mom, you don't look short when you're with your people." And I'm only 5 feet tall. But it was like there were 3 or 4 of us that were only 5 feet tall. And I was thinking, just the context, I fit in. And in Boston, I would fit in. In Texas, the Jewish community is a whole lot smaller. And the wall between religion and the state is much thinner here than it was in other places that I've lived. And so, for example, when my kids were in middle school, they were all into sports, and there was pressure on them to join the Christian athletes, the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, the FCA. And they would go to these gatherings and they would pray. And I'm thinking, this doesn't feel right. Or coaches that would gather their students and they'd say, we're going to win this football game in Jesus' name. And it's like, this doesn't, I'm not comfortable with that. And I'm not comfortable with any tie-in with religion and our education system. It's not just that I'm bothered by it if it's Christian. I don't want the two to be mixing. And where I am in Texas, they do. And so being Jewish is different here. And there is a visual difference. I mean, I think that I don't look like the Germanic population that came to Texas through the port city of Galveston and inhabited a lot of Central Texas. These guys are all 7 or 8 inches taller than me and blonde, and I'm not. There's an awareness of being different, but I've never felt like anybody tried to isolate me because of being Jewish in Texas. So I certainly don't mean to imply that. I think my parents faced a whole lot more discrimination than I did. With stuff like when my dad was going to medical school, it wasn't stated as such, but his first choice was Harvard, and he'd gone there as an undergraduate, and it seemed like a no-brainer that he'd go there for med school, and he didn't. And what he was told privately was they had enough Jewish doctors already. So he had a
quota,
at Boston University. What?
A quota, yeah.
Quota. They had a quota. And I never had to deal with anything like that. I did deal with, as a kid, there was a community pool down the street from us, and it was no Jews allowed. So it was a membership pool. We weren't welcome. So living in Florida in that heat, in a pool walking distance away, and I couldn't go use it. So certainly I have felt discrimination as a Jewish person, but as an adult, I would be misleading if I said that it had continued to be an issue. And now in Texas, there's actually almost an opposite of saying Jews are the chosen people, and lucky you, you get a second chance at the second coming. So it's
We have that here too, Joe. We
okay.
have that here too. Yeah. Um, well, I have one more question, but I want to take another moment. If anyone who's on the call has a question or a comment for Joe, it'd be a great time to unmute. Otherwise, I'll barrel ahead. Okay, well, seeing none, I'll ask my last question, at least for now. On a similar note, because of your family's experience kind of being steeped in civil rights movement and where you were, I'm interested to hear, I can't resist asking about your thoughts regarding the events of the last few years in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and sort of what that has looked like in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes.
Because I a lot of folks have linked aspects of it back to, at least back to the civil rights movement,
Sure.
if not to other times and movements. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Of course, and it feels like people think that this is, in many cases, people think this is new stuff that's happening, and that we now need to fight it. And I would say that this stuff never stopped happening. That Black people have been getting killed by police, which is really what the Black Lives Matter started with, all along, and that it's the invention of the cell phone and social media that's made people more aware of it. And I think that it's wonderful that people are more aware of it. I think that awareness is the first step toward fixing it. But when I say it's heartbreaking, we're fighting the same battles that we were now 50 years ago. And for 50 years, for 100 years before that. It is mind-boggling to me that states are trying to ban books that are about not just Black Lives Matter in the current politics, but if there's a Black writer or if there's a Black main character, that we have school districts that are pulling those books from the library. And the issue is not should they be pulled, it's should they be burned. We're running into that in some of the smaller towns in Texas. So I see it as the Black Lives Matter movement as a fantastic opportunity for people to become aware. And I think that it's going to help get more people voted into office that are aware that systemic racism is a real thing. Despite so many politicians saying it's not real, we're a post-racial society. We had a Black president, of course we're post-racial. It's just not true. And one of the fascinating things to me that I hear when I go and talk at schools is sometimes the Black students have said to me as part of a thank you, saying, I tell my friends about microaggressions and about stuff still happening, and they think I'm whining and that it's not real, that I'm making it up. And so it's nice to have an outsider come in and validate all of that. And on the one hand, I'm thinking, great, I'm happy to play that role. And on the other hand, I'm thinking, it's so sad that it takes a white person saying it in order for it to be believed. And then I start second guessing myself. How do I fit into the Black Lives Matter movement? And who am I, a white, middle-aged, middle-class individual with all this privilege and education to come in and try to help out? And I come up with two things, which maybe you will find helpful. One is that white people created these problems. And so white people have a responsibility to try to fix it, and that it is appropriate for us to be jumping in. And second, we will make mistakes. I will say stuff that is interpreted as insensitive, and I will learn. If someone's gracious enough to call me out on it and teach me, I can't let that stop me from trying. And as long as I am trying to learn, I've just got to trust that I'm doing some good. And so I think that the Black Lives Matter movement is an opportunity for all of us to participate, even if it's a little bit overwhelming.
Well, thank you for that answer. And I really appreciate so much the work that you do in writing and speaking. I want to mention to folks who are on the call before we end today that originally, a while back, we were hoping that this would be in person. And we still, I think Joe and I still have the hope that eventually Joe will be here in town and we'll do a number of different engagements. And I would love to have you as our guest at a luncheon once we can get those running again. Knock wood. I mean, who knows? Maybe later this year. We'll see. And I should say, it would also be wonderful for you to talk about your more recent book at that time as well. So
I would love to do that.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for attending. And thank you most of all, I think, to Joe for spending the time and for joining us today. Really meant a lot.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to meeting all of you in person.
We'll look forward to that day.
We do too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take
All
care.
right.
All.
Take care.